because the other two joints that are part of this kinetic chain, they don't have the same shape of this one. Hi, it's me, Eli, and today I'm going to be talking about kinetic chain and why that is important to know, to understand, and how to apply it to our asana practice and to our asana teaching when it comes to alignment, adjustment, why it is so important to understand this concept that comes from mechanical engineering. So to know the definition of kinetic chain, I'll invite you to go to my other video when I explain what is a kinetic chain and the types of kinetic chain. In this one, we're going to talk about why it's important and how we actually apply that knowledge to the practice, because my goal is to teach you anatomy of movement in a practical, meaningful, useful way, because names of bones and muscles, you can memorize them by reading any book of anatomy, but really understanding how to put that into a practical use it's quite tricky. It's not complicated, but anyway, that's my purpose, to teach you how to use that knowledge in a more useful way. So let's begin. We already talked about the differences between the open kinetic chain and a closed kinetic chain. So you will find, if you are a yoga teacher, or if you are becoming a yoga teacher, that some of these principles, actually, you will hear them in vinyasa classes. You will use them to create your vinyasa sequences. Your teachers may have cued it in that way, but we don't know the reason why. Or when we get adjusted, why some adjustments are effective and why other adjustments, I wouldn't say they're wrong, but they don't feel quite right and they are not as effective. Anyway, so when it comes to kinetic chain or to sequencing in vinyasa, we have heard that one of the principles of sequencing is to sequence flows that all the asanas, I'm talking when we're standing, for example, all the asanas should be the asanas that are, that they require that the hips are facing the long side of the mat, which are called open hip poses, which anatomically is not exactly accurate or complete, but in general, this is how things are referred. Open hip poses when your hips are facing the long side of the mat. So you have heard that when it comes to principles of sequencing, or maybe you have been practicing yoga like that for a very long time. When you are doing, let's say, a vinyasa flow, and all the poses that you're doing, so you did your vinyasa, you landed in, let's say, downward facing dog, you bring one foot forward, and they ask you to do trikonasana, and then warrior two, reverse warrior, go back to trikonasana, then ardha chandrasana. So if you see, all those poses are happening in this sagittal plane, in the frontal plane. And the frontal plane, when the movements are sideways, when your hips are facing the long side of the mat. And then you do a vinyasa, you land again in downward facing dog, and then your foot come forward. But now the poses that you're doing are all with closed hip closed hip or square hip poses, right? Again, not exactly accurate from the anatomical perspective, but this is how they are labeled, right? And that means those are the poses when your body is actually facing the short side of the mat. So here you will find warrior one, the reverse triangle, the reverse side angle, the reverse Ardha Chandrasana poses when you're facing the short side of the mat, and then you keep moving with other flows. So, It's not necessarily that you cannot go from open hip poses to closed hip poses. You can, of course you can. You can sequence it like that, you can practice it like that. But we have our legs planted on the floor. And that makes these kinetic chains closed kinetic chains, because the feet are grounded on the floor. The distal end of this kinetic chain, the distal end of this kinetic chain are now free of, they cannot move freely. They are grounded on the floor. The floor is stopping them from moving freely, which that makes these kinetic chains closed. And the important part of a closed kinetic chain is that the movement in one of the segments or one of the joints will impact the other ones. Because if we go back, before going to that, if we go back to the open kinetic chains, for example, the same pose, let's say we're doing warrior two. The hands in warrior two are open kinetic chains. The distal end is free to move. The movement that I do in one of these segments will barely affect the other segments, if they affect the other segments. So let's pay attention if I'm doing the arms of warrior two. We already established that this is an open kinetic chain. The hand, which is the distal segment of this kinetic chain, is open. Nothing is stopping the hand to move. So I can flex and extend the wrist and nothing happens to the other segments. Nothing is moving, nothing is even changing positions. I can flip the palm up and down, which is a very common movement that we found from warrior two, flipping the palm up and reversing your warrior. It's quite common, right? So I can flip the palm up and down. Now I ask you this. So answer this question. Where is this movement coming from? Just to revise some of the movements here. When I'm flipping the palm, where is this movement coming from? Is it coming from the wrist, from the elbow, from the shoulder? Let's see if you got it right. Anyway, this is material for another video when we talk about movements. But the right answer is this movement is coming from the radio-ulnar joint. If you said elbow, I will say that it's okay, it's fine. But technically it's not the elbow. The elbow only flexes and extends. That's it. It's a hinge joint. The radio-ulnar is these two. We have a bone that is called the radius and another one that is called the ulna. When the radius slides over the ulna, creates this movement that is called supination, pronation. So it's this bone sliding over the other bone. There's a joint in between those two, creating this movement, to be a little bit more precise. Anyway, so if you can see, we can flip the palm, but nothing is happening to the shoulder. If you don't believe me, and maybe you said that the movement was coming from the shoulder, place your hand on your shoulder. So you place your hand on your shoulder and flip the palm up and down, facing up, facing down. Did you feel any movement in the shoulder? No. Right? Because the movement is not coming from the shoulder. Because it's an open kinetic chain. And we can keep talking about more examples. So the movement in one of the joints in an open kinetic chain may not impact the other one. But when it comes to a closed kinetic chain, the things change. Right? That sounded like a trabalenguas in Spanish. Like my tongue was like, okay. So in a closed kinetic chain, when the distal end is blocked, is closed, the movement in one of the joints will impact the other ones. So I'm going to ask you to do this exercise with me, because the best way to understand how the anatomy, the concepts and the knowledge of anatomy actually make sense is when you actually do it. So go grab a mat, just be mindful, please don't fall, don't slide over there on your floor. So hopefully you have it with you, the mat, and we're gonna do this. So we're gonna do only the legs, right? So I just want to you to have this idea of the mechanic of what is happening in the legs of warrior 2 if we want to shift to warrior 1. Again, as I said, the principles of sequencing, majority of the time, the sellers do one sequence first. We do a vinyasa, we change to another direction, which is fine. And we're going to explain mainly why we taking care of by doing that. So let's put our legs in warrior 2 legs, right? So if you pay attention, your back toes are facing to the front. Let's call it they're facing, or they're in an angle of 90 degrees, right? So they're facing that direction. So when we try to shift from here to there, to go from warrior 2 to warrior 1, what needs to move? Where is the movement coming from? Who is producing that movement? So do it with me now. Now you're here with your legs in warrior 2 and you want to shift to warrior 1. So pay attention. What is your body doing? Which joint is producing the movement? Probably you already felt it, right? Is your hip. Your hip joint is trying to move your torso to go that way. Now, what of the movements of the joint is happening or is trying to happen by doing this? Especially I'm talking about the back leg. It's an internal rotation of the hip joint. So this joint is trying, the femur is trying to internally rotate so we can shift to that side. Good. Now, observe what happened if we only do that. If we only allow the hip to internally rotate, but we don't move anything else. We don't move the entire unit of movement, right? What happened? Where do you feel this? Be mindful, be careful, because actually this is something that we don't want to do. So be mindful, right? When we're doing this, see how your knee feels, how your ankle feels. So keep doing that. Probably you're feeling a lot of stress in your knee. Probably your knee doesn't feel very happy there. Why? Because when one of the joints of this closed kinetic chain is trying to move, it's going to move the whole thing. But because it's closed, the feet are grounded on the floor. If I am not aware of moving the whole system together, then the other segment, the other pieces that are in the way are going to start talking a little too loud. Because the other two joints that are part of this kinetic chain, they don't have the same shape of this one. This joint is a ball and socket joint with its particular movements, which one of them is the rotation. This internal rotation and the external rotation. The knee is a hinge joint. It's a joint that kind of have this shape. So the movements available at the knee joint is up and down, flexion and extension. And the ankle joint, there are many joints around there, but majority of them are flat, which means that if they're a gliding movement, there's some other type of joints there, but certainly they're not ball and socket joints there. Nobody can rotate the way the hip is trying to rotate. So the hip is trying to move the whole system, but nothing is happening. So if I don't pay attention to that, and I try, and unfortunately, I've seen a lot of students, either people who are only yoga practitioners or even people who are teachers or people who are graduating from becoming a yoga teacher, practicing warrior 1 with the leg of warrior 2, the back leg. Anyway, how do we solve this? We need to move the toes in. We already know that a lot of people do that. A lot of teachers cue this. Move your toes 45 degrees. So if they were looking that way in 90 degrees, now we're asking them to move 45 degrees. Why? Because the toes can only reach 45 degrees, 65 degrees, because the hip joint internally rotated. Otherwise, the toes cannot move. That movement is not coming from the ankle. Okay, so now that my toes move, that means that I allowed the whole kinetic chain to move, and now the hip can go and do its movement, which is internal rotation of the hip joint, and we can be in warrior one. So imagine explaining that in an asana class. When you have so many different people, when you're practicing with so many different people, people will understand different things, right? So even if you tell someone, or unless you are like, okay guys, we're going to shift, we're gonna do another pose, so please look at your back toes, leave your toes off the floor and bring your toes all the way in. Maybe you can sequence like that. You do your sequence from open hip poses and then you go to the other side. But maybe it's a lot to say. So that's why it becomes a little bit easier to finish everything in this plane and then do your vinyasa and go and do the other poses. So that is when it comes to sequencing. That, again, is not that you cannot sequence like that. Yes, you can. But we have to remember that in the moment that your feet or your hands are grounded on the floor, that becomes a closed kinetic chain. And any movement I do in any of the joints is going to impact the other one. So I have to pay attention of what happens in one of the joints when I try to move another joint. For adjusting, for example, if you are going to adjust or if you're going to be adjusted, this principle of this concept has to be present, and we have to have a lot of clarity about this, because now imagine, and I'm going to go back. One of the principles of adjusting, like hands-on adjustments, is that before you go and adjust, you have to observe the foundation of the pose, right? Here I'm using terminology of different aspects of the yoga practice. And I'm talking now about the theory of alignment and adjustment. And according to this theory, before we adjust someone, we have to observe the foundation of the asana. Anatomically speaking, the foundation of the asana is the distal end of that kinetic chain, because the foundation of the asana is where your body is based on. Where is your body? What is the support of your body? So what is the foundation of warrior two? The foundation of warrior two is the feet. And the feet are grounded on the floor. The foundation of downward facing dog, your hands and your feet. Everything that is in contact with the floor is the foundation of the asana. So when we are going to adjust, before we adjust, we have to pay attention to the foundation of the asana. So again, let's say I have a student that is in warrior one, and I'm going to adjust that person, and the aesthetic alignment book says that hips should be facing the front of the mat, square to the front of the mat. Okay, and I see someone with a hip that is not exactly square. It's quite difficult to have that movement when you have your leg in that position. That's why a lot of people modified by lifting the heel off the floor. But anyway, I'm coming to that. So I see my student in this position, and I'm like, oh, your hips are not facing the front of the mat, right? So I don't pay attention to what is happening to the foundation of that pose. I'm not paying attention to the distal end of that closed kinetic chain. And I want to come and adjust in the hips, right? Because the hips are the ones producing the movement. We already know the mechanic of the asana. I learned that in anatomy. Good. So let me go and adjust the hips. So I place the hands on the hips and I start shifting this pelvis, this hip forward. But we already know what movement is going to produce that internal rotation. But I didn't pay attention to the toes. And then look, my toes are 90 degrees. They're not 45. So I just come, adjust, push, and who's going to suffer? The other joints. And please don't say only the knee, okay? I will talk about the nonsense of yoga with this protected knee. It's not only the knee and the ankle, right? The ankle is the other piece of this kinetic chain. So the knee, the ankle, the other joints that are not able to do that movement are going to get impact, influence with this movement. Anyway, so how do we solve that? Again, before adjusting someone, pay attention to your foot. If someone comes right now to me and says, Eli, please lift your toes off the floor and move your toes 45, 60 degrees in, and then move your pelvis forward. This person doesn't even have to touch me. Nothing. By just saying that, I'm like, oh, okay, now I have more space. Of course you have more space because you move the whole unit of movement. That is your lower limbs. And now I can adjust. If for whatever reason we do the 45, the 60 degrees with the toes and it still is not getting there, then this is when you modify your warrior one by lifting the heel of the floor, because now by freeing a little bit more that distal segment, I have more space for this kinetic chain to move completely, and I have a space now to be in the pose facing the front of the mat. Wow, I hope that clarifies why it's important to know about the kinetic chain. So you have a video explaining what is it, the types, I kind of like review it here, and why it's important and how we can apply that to our practice, to our teaching when we are sequencing, the way that we cue, the way that we adjust. And when I say the way that we practice, when you are practicing, if you're alone and you're following your own movement, pay attention, be aware of where is your body moving from, which pieces of your body are moving and what others will follow, and how I need to move in order to move in harmony, that everybody is happy getting the benefits of the asana. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you with more anatomy of movement knowledge and practical uses, which is the most important part of it. See you soon. Bye-bye.